Professional baseball in America was notably unsettled around the turn of the 20th century as multiple competing professional leagues rose and fell. Much of what we understand to be how Major League Baseball works today really started in 1903 when the National League and the American League started playing the World Series. But there was a notably confusing period when the American League was trying to move to Major League status that resulted in a bizarre situation in Baltimore where two armed camps fought a war for control of a baseball field. The February 1900 battle for the control of the nearly forgotten Baltimore Union Field is a story that is so strange that you wouldn't believe it if it hadn't actually happened. There's still dispute over the exact origin of baseball, but there is a general agreement that the first time that rules were codified that resembled the modern game were by the New York Knickerbocker Club in 1845. Thus, baseball was still a fairly young sport when, in 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings became the first baseball club to be openly all professional. Every member of the team was paid to play. Not surprisingly, the first professional league formed shortly thereafter. The National Association of Professional Baseball Players was formed in 1871 and is largely considered to be the first professional league. In fact, one of the first professional sports leagues of any kind. It was formed out of a schism between amateur players and the growing number of professionals. The NABBP lasted for 5 seasons, from 1871 through the 1875 season. But the league faced many issues and eventually folded, with many teams going to a newly formed National League of Professional Baseball Clubs that had more central authority. Originally, there were 8 charter member clubs, although the teams would change with time. But the National League was not without competition, and in 1883 a competitor arrived. The American Association of Baseball Clubs was formed to combat the rather stricter rules of the National League. Dr. Robert Shipley of Rutgers University explained in a 1995 publication of the Society for American Baseball Research. Formed largely through the aggressive planning and capital of 4 large brewers, the American Association survived and occasionally prospered by marketing itself with 25-cent seats, Sunday baseball, and the sale of beer. The AA gained enough credibility between 1884 and 1890 that they played a championship series with the National League, an early predecessor to the World Series. Among the new AA teams was Baltimore, the Baltimore Baseball and Exhibition Company, better known as the Orioles, owned by brewery mogul Harry Vanderhorst. The Orioles would have a wild ride through the early innings of professional baseball history, but in the AA they simply weren't very good. Author David B. Stimson explains, unlike the National League, however, the American Association permitted its franchises to sell beer at their home games. Harry Vanderhorst installed a beer garden in his ballpark and encouraged fans to remain even after the game had ended to consume more beer. Although the American Association Orioles, they were the first professional Baltimore baseball team to be known as the Orioles, never placed higher than 3rd during their decade in existence, the sale of beer at the games proved quite profitable. The league operated until 1891, but conflict within the league and team defections to the National League finally brought its demise. 4 of the remaining AA teams were then folded into the National League, and among them were the Orioles. For the 1892 season, Vanderhorst hired Ned Hanlon as the team manager, giving him a stake in the team. Hanlon had been a standout outfielder and shortstop with the Cleveland Blues and the Detroit Wolverines. After the Wolverines folded in 1888, his contract was sold to the Pittsburgh Alleghenies, a former AA team that had skipped to the National League. Hanlon's somewhat questionable midnight signing of a player from Philadelphia is purportedly the event that led to the Pittsburgh team gaining the nickname Pirates. Because don't all good stories involve pirates? During their championship time, the team played at Union Field. Mike Kingeman of Baltimore Sun explains, Union Park, home of the celebrated 19th century Orioles, went up in 17 days at a cost of $7,500. In less than 3 weeks, workers turned a hilly pasture with trees and a stream into a big league diamond, complete with beer garden, picnic grounds, and a ladies' grandstand. The Society for American Baseball Research explains that at the time it was built, Union Park was the largest ballpark in the American Association, and the first in Baltimore to have a double-decked grandstand. There for 9 years, the Orioles would strut their stuff, the likes of which baseball had never seen. The 8,000-seat Union Park Stadium sat on 25th Street between Guilford Avenue and Barclay Street. The play there, Kingeman explains, included some of the antics of the time. At Union Park, the Orioles weren't averse to doctoring the baselines to favor their bunts. In the outfield, they hit extra balls in the grass should a base hit bound past them, and they sprinkled soap flakes on the mound, which stuck to the hands of opposing pitchers and messed with their control. Sports writer Hugh Fullerton claimed that Union Park was the most unfair grounds ever constructed. It took some time. The Orioles finished last in the league in 1892 and eighth in 1893, but Hanlon put together a team of all-stars. 6 players from the team: Wilbert Robinson, Dan Brothers, Huey Jennings, John McGraw, Wee Willie Keeler, and Joe Kelly, as well as Hanlon himself, would eventually be inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. The Orioles won 3 consecutive pennants in 1894, 95, and 96, and followed up with 2 second-place finishes. Hanlon became known as Foxy Ned and pioneered plays such as the squeeze play and the sacrifice bunt. The team was a powerhouse, but the capriciousness of leagues in early baseball was already setting them up for a conflict. The team's success and attendance dropped off significantly in 1898, and Vonderhorst, assuming that the winning team was losing steam, engineered a merger with the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, putting the 2 teams under the same ownership, and that allowed them to take the best talent from both teams, and it was able to move Hanlon to Brooklyn in 1899. There, Hanlon was the cause of another nickname change. The press coined the team the Superbas, the name of a former New York vaudeville act performed by 2 apparently unrelated brothers named Hanlon. The team wouldn't formally use the nickname Trolley Dodgers until 1916. The Superbas won the National League pennant in 1899 and 1900. But John McGraw and Wilbert Robertson had been left behind, by some accounts refusing to move as they had financial interests in Baltimore. With McGraw as player-manager, the Orioles exceeded expectations and finished a respectable 4th in 1899. They might have won the pennant had McGraw not had to take a month off in August owing to the illness of his wife. The Society for American Baseball Research writes that Hanlon himself called the 1899 Orioles the surprise of the season. His Brooklyn team, of course, won the pennant. But the National League was struggling. An expansion to 12 teams after the collapse of the AA had diluted the player base, and several teams were struggling financially. The league decided to contract back to 8 teams. And despite their success, Baltimore was one of the teams eliminated. But McGraw didn't want to give up on Baltimore baseball. There was talk of reviving the American Association, and the new association targeted cities that had been abandoned by the National League, and McGraw planned for his Orioles to be one of the 8 teams in the new league. Moreover, he found out that Hanlon and Vonderhorst had made a mistake. They had allowed their lease to expire on Union Ballpark. Having gotten financial backing for the new team, McGraw snapped up the lease. The Sun wrote, "Manager John J. McGraw, Baltimore's American Association baseball team, scored yesterday what is probably the greatest coup that has yet been made by the association when he secured the Union Park grounds for his team." The Sun was, of course, happy with the deal, which they saw as guaranteeing a professional baseball would continue in Baltimore. The significance of the acquisition cannot be overstated, they opined. It proves that the talk about an association team in this city is founded on facts and money. Notably, the Sun wrote, a remarkable feature about the deal is that the stands, clubhouse, etc. on the grounds are expected to go to the new lessees. Mr. Hanlon and the other owners of the league team have no right to the improvements that they have made. But Hanlon didn't agree on that point, and that would lead to one of the strangest moments in baseball history. While the lease was for the park and facilities, Hanlon and Vonderhorst objected, as the stands, clubhouse, and other improvements had been made and paid for by Vonderhorst's exhibition company. McGraw and company got a court injunction to keep Hanlon and Vanderhorst from removing or destroying any of the fixtures at Union Park. Angered, Hanlon hired armed guards to keep McGraw and his people from entering the field and plastered the fence with no trespassing signs. The situation was serious. The Chicago Inter-Ocean reported, "War for possession of Union Park by the association forces began in earnest today. President Peterson and Attorney Sams went to the grounds in person this morning and demanded entrance. They were met by a force of 5 men, fully armed, who refused to open the door. Other men, also armed, were seen patrolling the stands and fences. The force is about a dozen, said to be desperate men, and Hanlon says that they have orders to shoot anyone trying to enter." Peterson, president of the new association team, the report says he has secured the backing of the police board and expects to bombard the fortress. The 2 camps seemed braced for all-out war. What happened next is somewhat disputed. By one account, on February 3rd, 1900, some of McGraw's players scaled the fence and a brawl started between the McGraw people and the Hanlon people that was eventually stopped by police. The Interocean wrote, Peterson leapt on the little house on which the umpire dresses, but was immediately confronted by Reddy, the groundkeeper. As a struggle ensued, each tried to throw the other off. They were on even terms when Deputy Marshal Farman came on the scene and separated the combatants. By another account, Philip Peterson, secretary of the American Association team, climbed the fence, pummeled one of the guards, and left in his pocket the court order that kept Hanlon from removing any property from the grounds. In any case, the stadium was now occupied. The Interocean wrote, the rest of the Peterson crowd had reached the top of the house and leapt onto the grounds. They ran for third base, McGraw's corner, and there pitched their camp. The Hanlon forces took possession of first base. The stadium now disputed, the Society for American Baseball Research explains. McGraw's men, carrying guns and clubs, set up camp at third base. On the other side of the diamond, Hanlon's men set up shop at first base. A single police officer took his post in front of the ticket office. The two literally camped on the field while the argument over ownership went to the courts. The New York Times described this strange situation. All last night and throughout today until a heavy rainstorm this evening drove them to shelter, the opposing baseball forces occupied the disputed grounds at Union Park, and the campfire burned brightly on either side of the diamond. A squad of policemen patrolled the grounds, and more of the Bluecoats guarded the entrance to prevent any further invasion and keep the crowd of rooters and curious people inside. The Baltimore populace, the Times writes, were evenly divided, but at times McGraw and the association people were lightly cheered. Referring to the ongoing conflict in South Africa, the Times wrote, the opposing forces were likened to the Boers and the British, the association people being called the Burghers. The Times noted that the opposing forces were not made up of the players themselves, but groundskeepers and other employees. The league men have possession of the clubhouse and grandstand and the main defenses, while McGraw's little army holds the right field. The general assumption of the Times, though, on February 4th, was that McGraw's claim would prevail, as the property owners, sympathetic to McGraw, indicated that the lease was duly executed. But just a day later, the Boston Globe reported, however, that the factions claiming the baseball grounds at Baltimore were tired of camping. Still, the camps were still there on February 6th, when the Chicago Interocean reported that the only change in the situation at Union Park today was the withdrawal of the policemen from the inside of the park by order of the park board. An inquiry was made by it into the status of the case, and it was said that the police had either done too much or had not done enough on Saturday afternoon. But the courts were not really required, as shifting leagues had created the situation, so they resolved it, or rather made it irrelevant. David Hill of Fox Sports explains, in the end, this battle was for naught. After the Philadelphia franchise was unable to find grounds for a stadium and backed out, the eighth team, Providence, also left the association. The association was forced to call off its league, leaving Baltimore without a franchise that year. McGraw and Robinson played that year for St. Louis, and Baltimore was without a professional team for the first time since 1883. The issue of the field was settled, with Hamlin keeping the lease and paying the former association the cost of 1 year's lease, $3,500, and the Society for American Baseball Research explains, $1,500 to $2,000, which purportedly represented the expense incurred by the amusement company to establish a team in Baltimore. Before leaving, the Society writes, they made a final curtain call at Union Park in a game between the Baltimore newspapermen and the cast of the musical Broadway of Tokyo. In what was dubbed a horrible game of baseball, the Robinson-led actors prevailed in a painful score of 19-0 over McGraw's newspapermen. But McGraw had not abandoned Baltimore. In 1901, the former minor league Western Association announced yet another competitor for the National League, an upstart American League, and McGraw acquired the rights to a team in Baltimore. McGraw, however, felt that the team needed a new stadium, as the lease for Union Field was set to expire. The new American League Orioles lasted just 2 years before folding. In 1903, the National and American Leagues agreed to a truce and to try to coexist, and the National League allowed for an American League team in New York to play alongside the Giants. The Orioles were sold to New York. That team would become the New York Yankees. Union Ballpark still hosted local and college games, and for a while Hanlon hoped to lease it again in hopes of bringing an American League team, or maybe an association team, as there was talk of reviving the American Association to compete with the American League, but neither materialized. It isn't clear exactly when the park was torn down, but by 1905 the grounds had been replaced by houses. Hill writes, today the grounds are home to apartment buildings and a parking lot, an ignoble fate for a former baseball stadium, and one that housed some of the more legendary players of its time. While there was a minor league team that used the name, the Orioles didn't return for Major League Baseball in Baltimore until 1954. That team had been a founding member of the American League as the Milwaukee Brewers in 1901. Had been sold to St. Louis, where they played as the Browns for 52 years before being sold to a group of Baltimore investors. The strange invasion and occupation of Baltimore's Union Park is, well, one of the odder events in the history of the sport, but it also overshadows the memory of the long-demolished baseball venue. Of 599 games that were played at Union Park, the Orioles won an astounding 413 to losses of just 186, a win rate of .680. Perhaps the field was worth fighting over, after all. Hi, I'm the History Guy. I have a degree in history and I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. On July 4th of 1950, a tragedy occurred during the warm-ups of a doubleheader baseball game between the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. It is a heartbreaking story, and one that is not as uncommon as you might think. It is a story that should be remembered. Bernard Barney Doyle went to early Mass on Tuesday, July 4th, 1950. The 54-year-old retiree had to get moving early that day. He had promised to take his 13-year-old neighbor, Otto Flegg, to a doubleheader baseball game, and they wanted to get to the stadium in time to see the warm-ups. Bernard Lawrence Doyle had been born in County Dublin, Ireland. At one point in his life, he had managed prize fighters, and his biggest claim to fame was having been an early manager of Jim Braddock, helping the eventual 1935 to 1937 world heavyweight champion start his career. Doyle had had a career in the freight industry, but had been forced to retire due to ill health. The resident of Fairview, New Jersey, was a passionate fan of the New York Giants baseball team. Originally, he had promised to take his neighbor's son Otto to a game the Friday before, but he had decided to wait until this game because he found out that that Friday game was a night game and he didn't want to keep the boy out late. The pair had gotten tickets to a sold-out doubleheader between Doyle's beloved Giants and crosstown rival Brooklyn Dodgers. In the first game, left-hander Monty Kennedy was pitching for the Giants against Don Newcomb for the Dodgers. At home, the rest of Doyle's family was watching the game on television. The game was being played on the famed Polo grounds. The stadium for the New York Giants had been built in 1890, and it was well known for its unique bathtub shape, which gave relatively little room to the walls on left and right field, but an abnormally large center field. Their tickets were in row C of section 42, which was on the upper deck facing home plate. At 20 minutes after noon, the Dodgers took the field for batting practice. Doyle leaned over to Otto to say something. Fans in the section said they heard a noise, like a paper bag popping, and Doyle slumped in his seat. Otto Flegg turned to his friend and asked if he was okay, and got no answer, and he was afraid that maybe his friend had had a heart attack. A fan came forward, claiming to be a doctor, and said, "That man's dead." When attendants got to him, they found out that he had a head wound. In fact, he had been struck just above the left temple with a .45 caliber bullet, which had lodged in his brain, killing him instantly. Most of the 49,000 fans in the stadium had no idea what had happened. Even when he was carried away, they didn't know the circumstances or even that he was dead. Even the fans in his section merely assumed that he had fallen ill. The fans in the section were said to have fought over the 2 new empty seats. Noting that there were no powder burns or cuts on the wound, police quickly determined that the shot had to have come from outside the stadium. They interviewed 10 boys who had been seen playing in the bushes on Coogan's Bluff above the stadium, but they got no leads. No one, it seems, had witnessed the shooting. But in ensuing searches, they found a .22 caliber rifle and .22 caliber handgun in an apartment belonging to 14-year-old Robert M. Peebles. At first, Peebles denied knowing anything about the shooting, but on July 8th, he confessed to detectives. According to Peebles, he had found a handgun with just 1 bullet in it in New York's Central Park 6 months before. He had hidden the handgun away, planning to fire it off on July 4th as a celebration. He denied any intent to shoot anybody on the Polo grounds, and in fact, the roof from which he had fired the gun had a wall taller than him, so he could not even see the stadium. The bullet flew more than 1,100 feet before it killed Barney Doyle. When he heard that someone had been killed in the stadium, Peebles had ditched the gun in a field. At the age of 14, he was too young to be charged with murder, so he was charged with juvenile delinquency. Even police agreed that the killing did not appear to be deliberate. He was sent to Juvenile Hall, the New York State Training School for Boys in Warwick, New York, for 2 years. Now, you'd like to think that this instance was unique, that it couldn't happen again, but it wasn't. At least 3 other fans of Major League Baseball had been struck in stadiums by bullets fired from outside the stadium. On June 9th of 2000, a 64-year-old woman was struck in Kansas City's Kauffman Stadium during a game between the Kansas City Royals and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Another bullet struck an empty seat but didn't injure anyone. The fan was injured in the abdomen and the arm and spent the night in the hospital. No suspect in the shooting was ever identified. On June 16, 2012, a 55-year-old visiting Tampa Bay fan was struck in the leg by a bullet during a game between the Tampa Bay Devil Rays and the Florida Marlins. The bullet had so little velocity that it merely bruised his leg. He thought he had been struck by a foul ball until someone fished under a seat and came up with a bullet. What is most surprising about this is that St. Petersburg's Tropicana Stadium is roofed. The bullet had apparently been fired miles away and had come all the way through the roof of the stadium before striking the fan. St. Petersburg's police assumed that the bullet must have been fired in celebration, which is a common practice in the American South, and very similar to the bullet that had, of course, killed Barney Doyle. And most recently, on May 2nd of 2017, a woman who was seated near the dugout in St. Louis's Busch Stadium watching a game between the St. Louis Cardinals and the Milwaukee Brewers was struck in the arm by a bullet that seems to have come from outside the stadium. The bullet had so little velocity that while it pierced her jacket, it caused an abrasion so light that it could be treated at the stadium's first aid station. A falling bullet usually tumbles back to earth with much less velocity than it had when it left the chamber, but it can still be deadly, as the story of Barney Doyle proves. A study at just one Los Angeles hospital covering the period between 1985 and 1992 found that the hospital had treated 118 people for random falling bullet injuries, and 38 of those had died. The death of 14-year-old Shannon Smith to a falling bullet in Phoenix, Arizona in 1999 led to the passage of something called Shannon's Law, making it a felony to discharge a firearm into the air. But the practice goes well beyond the United States. Celebratory firing is a common practice throughout the world. In fact, one common practice is to celebrate weddings by firing bullets in the air, and there are several examples where that practice has had deadly results for members of the wedding party. In 2003, when it was reported that dictator Saddam Hussein's son Uday and Qusay had been killed in Iraq, there was so much celebratory firing that 20 people died. There have been educational programs throughout the world trying to address the problem, and some statistics show that it has become less common recently, and yet incidents still occur. The sad story of Barney Doyle is largely forgotten, but it should not be, because it serves as a stark reminder to everyone who owns a firearm of a simple rule: what goes up must come down. 1974 was a depressing news year in the United States. President Richard Nixon was embroiled in the Watergate scandal, which would eventually force him to resign in November, the first U.S. president to do so. The United States economy was in a deep recession, the result of double-digit inflation and the ongoing energy crisis. Patricia Hearst, the granddaughter of publishing magnate William Randolph Hearst, was kidnapped in February and by April had claimed that she had joined her captor's cause, leading to nightly news stories. And on June 4th, in the event that perhaps best defined the trying times of the day, beer was too cheap in Cleveland, Ohio. It is history that deserves to be remembered. It was Tuesday, June 4th, and the Texas Rangers were playing a night game at Cleveland Stadium, the first of a 3-game series. Coming off of 2 consecutive 100-loss seasons, Texas was 25-25, 4 games back from the American League West leading Oakland Athletics. The Cleveland Indians were 24-25, 2.5 games back from the AL East leading Boston Red Sox. Fritz Peterson, a southpaw who had been traded to the Indians by the Yankees in April, was slated to start for the Indians. He was 3-3 on the season. Cleveland Municipal Stadium, the first sports venue in the United States built entirely with public financing, opened in 1931. It's one of the first multi-purpose stadiums and had been home to the Cleveland Indians since its opening, and to the Cleveland Browns, originally with the All-American Football Conference and then with the National Football League since 1946. When configured for baseball, the stadium seated 74,400 fans, making it the largest in professional baseball in 1974. But Cleveland was a struggling city. Noted for its river pollution, the Cuyahoga River through the city was famous for literally catching fire. One such fire in 1969 had caught the attention of the nation via Time magazine, prompting the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. The Cleveland area had been a flashpoint for anti-Vietnam War sentiment after shootings by the National Guard at nearby Kent State University in 1970. The city was in financial difficulty. Crime was on the rise. In 1962, there had been 59 murders in Cleveland. In 1972, there were 333. The city had a difficult reputation, and people were leaving in droves. The city lost roughly 177,000 inhabitants between 1970 and 1980. And the Cleveland Indians simply weren't very good. They'd finished at the bottom of the American League East in 1973 and weren't doing much better in 1974. Commentator Paul Jackson of ESPN said of them, "The 74 Indians were a smorgasbord of mediocre and forgettable talent, playing in an open-air mausoleum." It had become difficult to fill the massive 74,400-seat stadium. On May 13th, a mere 4,234 had showed up on a chilly night for a game against Boston. On average, 85% of the stadium's tickets went unsold. But the game against Texas on the muggy night, June 4th, attracted a respectable 25,134 crowd, twice what was expected. The reason? Cheap beer. The club was running a promotion, 12 fluid-ounce cups of Stroh's 3.2% beer for just 10 cents each. There was a limit of 6 beers per purchase, but no limit on the number of purchases made during the game. The promotion wasn't new. Several teams in the league, including Texas, had done the promotion. Cleveland had done its first such promotion in 1971, when the beer was only 5 cents. It was an effective promotion for the stadium, so much so that the vendors had trouble serving everyone. Bud Tucker, a columnist for the Independent Press Telegram of Long Beach, California, quipped, "As a Frenchman is inspired by fine wine, or a Russian by classic vodka, so does a Clevelander react to 10-cent beer." The late Tim Russert, known for being the longtime moderator of the show Meet the Press, was 24 at the time and attended the game. In a statement that perhaps defined much of the crowd that night, he said, "I had $2 in my pocket. You do the math." Perhaps there was more going on that night than cheap beer. It was particularly hot and muggy. The June date caught the college-age crowd just as they were coming home for summer, and as Anthony Castrovence of MLB.com noted in 2014, it was a full moon that night. In fact, witnesses note that much of the crowd seemed to have not waited for the cheap beer, and many seemed to have arrived already drunk or high. And for some reason, they also showed up with their pockets stuffed with firecrackers. The crowd started throwing them before the game even started, and they continued throughout. The rowdiness may have had something to do with the team's last meeting a week earlier, on May 29th in Arlington, which had had a bench-emptying brawl during the 8th inning of what would be a Rangers 3-0 victory. Rangers fans had thrown beer and food at the Indians team as they were returning to the dugout. The Indians were furious. Catcher Dave Duncan had to be restrained to keep him from going into the stands to brawl with the crowd. Indians second baseman Jay Brohammer, who had been at the bottom of the pile, promised revenge. Rangers manager Billy Martin added to the fuel. After the game, a Cleveland reporter asked him if he was afraid of fans retaliating in Cleveland. He responded, "Nah, they don't have enough fans to worry about." Cleveland media kept the city riled over the course of the next week. On the morning of the 4th, several newspapers ran a story recalling the May 29 fight and noting, hopefully, the battling will be strictly in the form of baseball. The Newark Advocate of Newark, Ohio ran the story under the headline, "Rangers and Indians to resume base brawling." Brohammer was quoted as saying that he had cooled down and wasn't looking for a fight. Instead, he hoped to get revenge by winning all 3 games of the upcoming series. Indians manager Ken Espermonte doubted that there would be any trouble, saying that when these things happen, they're spontaneous and not planned. The Cleveland fans, on the other hand, might have been making plans of their own. Texas quickly took the lead in the 2nd inning after a home run by outfielder Tom Grieve. But a buzz was in the air, or rather, in the crowd. At the end of the 2nd inning, a woman hopped the fence, ran over to the Indians' on-deck circle, ripped off her shirt, baring her breast to the raucous approval of the crowd, and then tried to kiss the umpire. Amazingly, it wasn't the weirdest thing that would happen that night, nor the only act of exhibitionism. The fun was not all good-natured. Not only was the crowd throwing firecrackers and keeping the grounds crew busy throwing garbage onto the field, but when Rangers pitcher Fergie Jenkins got hit in the stomach with a line drive, the crowd started chanting, "Hit him again!" Meanwhile, the beer kept flowing. Unable to keep up, the vendors reportedly gave up trying to check IDs and started filling up whatever container was handed to them. 19-year-old fan Terry Yurkic recalled, "I had a big Dog and Suds mug, maybe 32 ounces. Looked like a mini keg." Another witness said that as the crowd, which he described as notably younger and longer-haired than usual, grew progressively more drunk, there was some antics every half inning or so. Young fans ran onto the field and dodged security. When Grieve hit a second home run in the fourth, extending the Rangers' lead to 5-1, a naked man ran onto the field and slid into second base. In the fifth inning, a father-son team jumped onto the field and booed the crowd. Another streaker ran across the field carrying his clothes with him, but still wearing his left sock. As he approached the fence, he threw his clothes over, planning his escape. The crowd could see what he could not. A Cleveland police officer was on the other side of the fence, catching both the clothes and the offender. The game had to be halted in the sixth, as the crowd was throwing firecrackers into the bullpen. Umpire Nestor Shylak cleared the bullpen, but was trying to let play continue. Fans were no longer just throwing beer and firecrackers, but also rocks, batteries, and any part of the stadium that wasn't bolted down. A group of fans started trying to tug the padding off the left field wall, drawing the grounds crew away from picking up the growing pile of trash that was landing on the field. Despite the antics, the game continued, and Cleveland managed to tie the game at 5-all in the bottom of the ninth, with 2 out and the winning run on second. But then 19-year-old Terry Yurkic, the fan with the Dogs and Suds mug, decided that he wanted a souvenir. It was not a good decision. He jumped the fence, ran up behind Texas outfielder Jeff Burroughs, and grabbed his hat. There's some controversy regarding what happened next. According to Yurkic, Burroughs kicked him. But because of the slope of the diamond from the Rangers' dugout, all Billy Martin could see was Burroughs' legs, and it looked like he'd been knocked down. More fans were climbing onto the field, and Martin thought, Jeff was out there all by himself. I saw knives and other things. We just couldn't let our teammate get beat up. He ordered his team onto the field, carrying bats to protect Burroughs. It was not a good decision. Seeing the Rangers leave the dugout sparked the already riled and inebriated mob. Fans stormed the field, greatly outnumbering the players. Martin recalled, "Now I know how the people of the Alamo felt." The crowd was carrying knives, chains, clubs made from stadium seats. Stadium security was overwhelmed, although it's hard to see what they could have done in any case, and no one had considered asking for a greater police presence. Seeing the melee and Rangers players being injured, Aspromonte ordered the Indians onto the field. The two teams, who had been fighting each other so recently, made common cause against the mob. Outnumbered, they fought their way back to the dugouts and retreated into the locker rooms behind locked doors. Shylak, bleeding from a cut on his head from a thrown bottle, called the game as soon as the players made it inside. He said he didn't do it earlier for fear it would spark retaliation against the players. The game was called a forfeit, going into the record books as a 9-0 loss for the Indians. Fans kept rioting, stealing everything they could take, including, literally, stealing the stadium's bases. So really, the organist played Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Director of Stadium Operations Dan Zerbe ordered the lights shut off, and the Cleveland police arrived and restored order. Despite the apparent violence, there were no serious injuries and less than a dozen arrests. Area hospitals reported 7 people treated and released. Martin was quoted saying, "That's the closest you'll ever see to a guy getting killed in baseball." Zerbe opined, "There is no doubt in my mind what caused the problem. It was the beer." Shylak called the crowd uncontrollable beasts. Indians Vice President Alva Bonda said, "In the end, there was no way that even 1,000 policemen could have controlled the few that were determined to act up," but nonetheless blamed Shylak and the crew for failing to control the game and protested the forfeit. Newspapers had a field day. The Windsor Star headline read, "Soust Tribe fans force forfeit." Some responded with humor, but others took the riot seriously and called for an end to beer sales at baseball games. Despite the calls to change the sport and stop selling beer at Major League Baseball games, nothing really changed. The American League issued a memorandum instructing all teams to let them know in advance if they're going to have any promotional events. And the Indians decided that the next time they had a 10-cent beer night that they would limit patrons to 4 beers per night, no exceptions. Actually, in the end, it appeared that this is one of those spontaneous events. The Indians and the Rangers played the next 2 nights. They split the wins, and there were no incidents. And the Indians held another 10-cent beer night in July, and that went without incident, or at least without a riot. The Rangers finished the season 84-76, second in the American League West behind the A's, who won the series that year. They were the first, and so far only, team in Major League Baseball history to finish over 500 after 2 consecutive 100-loss seasons. Burroughs was the American League MVP, Hargrove the Rookie of the Year, and the Associated Press named Billy Martin the American League Manager of the Year. The Cleveland Indians finished 77 and 85, a lackluster 4th in the American League East. 10-cent beer night perhaps summed up, well, a dismal decade for Cleveland and their baseball team. The prospects for both would eventually improve, but not really until the 1990s. Terry Yerkick, the fan whose desire for a souvenir apparently sparked the riot, perhaps summed up the attitude of Clevelanders to both their city and their baseball team at the time. He said, "It never occurred to us that they would forfeit. We were disappointed, yes, but the Indians weren't very good then. It's not like it cost them a pennant or anything." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.